Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. Hello, friends, and welcome to the first episode of the Mythological Africans podcast for the year 2026. We are a whole month into the year already, which is crazy, but that's quite all right. I've made it a tradition to take the month of January off, and so far I'm finding that this works well for my mental health. So I hope you are doing whatever is necessary on your end to take care of yourself wherever you're listening from, because we are living in interesting times, friends, and that is putting it lightly. The truth, however, is that we have always lived in interesting times, be they as a result of human machinations or the impersonal workings of the planet. Somewhere, somehow, and all the time, the human experience has always been fraught with difficulty, peril, and chaos. The difference might be that this time, the interestingness of our times has stumbled over the precipice of technological advancements that are radically redefining what it means to be a person witnessing and participating in society, as well as long overdue cultural reckonings, which are only just starting to lean into the full potential of what they could mean for the trajectory of humanity. But even then, we've been here before. Our times, as apocalypse adjacent as they are, as high the heights as the ladder of their chaos might carry those who there might be, our times are nothing new. Chaos perpetually permeates the human experience, and some are more shielded from it than others. But it has always been, and I dare say it will always be with us. Across the globe, stories from myth, legend, and folklore have faithfully recorded accounts of these chaotic times. And in the process, in fragments or in remarkably well preserved wholes, they have also conserved the thoughts, feelings, and actions of the people who lived through these times. And when we read these stories, we encounter easily recognizable figures, circumstances, and images through whom and which we might find insight into present situations, or at the very least, solace in the fact that other people and societies have lived through and survived times like these before. To put it simply, these stories contain archetypes. In Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung proposes that quote unquote primitive tribal lore, that is, myth, legend, and folklore, contains a phenomenon called archetypes. Archetypes are patterns of behavior, circumstances, images, and ideas which occur repeatedly in the unconscious thoughts of a given collective of people, and so are expressed in oral traditions, in art, in ritual, in philosophy, and other domains of communication and relationship. When this happens, archetypes leave the realm of the unconscious and crystallize into more tangible forms, which makes it possible for them to be handed down from generation to generation. For example, many patterns of behavior have coalesced into archetypal figures that show up in myths and folklore and other literature. These include the hero, the ruler, the innocent, etc. But there are other less obvious but no less powerful patterns of behavior which inform archetypes like the anima and the animus, the shadow, the persona, and the self. In Jungian analysis, these are the four main archetypes. The word archetype comes from the Greek word archetypos, which means original pattern. And Carl Jung's theories about archetypes are not exactly new. They have their roots in ideas proposed by philosophers from as far back as the first century of the Common Era. And this includes people like Philo of Alexandria, Dionysius the Areopagite, and Saint Irenaeus. Then the term was applied to God as the unknown archetypal pattern from which the knowns of the universe emerge. Jung brought the idea of archetypes down from the realm of the sacred and presented it as an emanation of what he called the collective unconscious. And what is the collective unconscious? This is the repository of human memories, impulses, and desires accumulated over the course of millennia of human evolution. The way Jung sees it, this collective unconscious, is shared unconscious understanding of the world, is the psychic substrate, if you want to think about it in terms of chemistry, the substrate from which our personalities and other visible aspects of our psychological and emotional tendencies emerge. So, in Jung's way of looking at it, an observer might arrive at an understanding of what motivates and animates a given group of people by observing how archetypes are expressed and how they evolve in their oral traditions, in their art, in their rituals, and other aspects of culture. It's helpful to think of archetypes as having three levels. First, there is the archetype itself, the basic pattern of behavior or circumstances that you're apprehending. An example of this is the innocent, which is an understanding of purity and freedom and openness. And then there is the image associated with the archetype. And this is a symbolic expression of this pattern in everyday life, in imagination, in art and religion and general culture. So the fact that videos of children, puppies, and kittens are so dominant in our present media are examples of the archetypal image of the innocent. Finally, there is a level of cultural symbol, which is the archetype and its image concretized into a specific figure, including the likes of the baby Jesus, Mudeng, the pygmy hippopotamus of internet fame, Hello Kitty, Pikachu, and others. Now, this is a podcast about African mythology and folklore, so why am I going on and on about archetypes? Now, I generally hesitate to apply theories derived from Western frameworks to the African context, and even more so when the articulation and application of these theories in the Western context themselves are subject to significant criticism, as is the case for Jung's theory of archetypes. It has been accused of drawing too straight a line between the behaviors of people in the past and those of their descendants without accounting for the influence of environment, changing times, and other complexities. There is also the fact that the theory is based on the still mysterious, collective unconscious. But then there is recent research in evolutionary biology, cognitive psychology, quantum mechanics, and even robotics that's probing into this idea of there being a collective unconscious. Jung was also a man of his time, so his own prejudices and assumptions leaked into his theories and their articulation. I do, however, think that even in the African context, it's worthwhile to explore what applying the idea of archetypal frameworks to myths and legends and folklore might reveal. And I say this because in the last century and a quarter, an incredible amount of time and energy and resources has been spent on stereotypes. Now, stereotypes are different from archetypes in that they are usually oversimplified, rigid, and too often biased perceptions that people have of others and use to judge them. Now, Black and African people as a whole have been locked in an all out war against negative stereotypes for longer than is reasonable. Matter of fact, the culture wars that perennially rage on social media could easily be called the battle of the stereotypes. It's just an unending campaign of anything you can do, I can do better. And in our current world, in which so much communication happens in this context with limited attention spans, which require quick takes in time limited reels and TikToks or word limited posts, is not helping the situation. Stereotypes almost always contain a kernel of truth too, which to a biased observer will always be evidence for their prejudice. So it's never going to stop. And as they say, one cannot carry water with a basket. Archetypes offer a little bit more. There's a little bit more nuance with them. I find them to be a bit more humanizing, especially if you think about them as tendencies, right? Organizational patterns within the psyche of people rather than fixed courses of action and reaction. For one, archetypes usually have a positive and negative expression, which manifest under different circumstances. And this fact alone makes them more accessible than stereotypes. For to invoke an archetype is to invoke the context in which that archetype is showing up, and to present their negative expression is to acknowledge the potential for their positive expression, and vice versa. Another characteristic of archetypes is their numinosity. That is, they are numinous. They have a capacity to evoke a sense of mystery and sacredness and sublimity. And this is because archetypes arrive from that realm of preserved human memory and instinct across space and time. This is the domain of the core of human consciousness, that mysterious core that we still haven't figured out, but whose convection currents power the psychic tectonic plates that grind into each other and trigger the sequence of mental and emotional events that make it possible for us to create meaning out of what would be mere biochemical processes. So, by turning to them instead of stereotypes, which arise out of more immediate and often time and place bound observations of human behavior, we have an opportunity to shift from this exhausting polarity of trying to use positive stereotypes to counter negative ones to a more neutral position that can hold duality and ambiguity and accept all as part of the human experience. So, this year on the Mythological Africans podcast, we'll spend some time with the archetypes as expressed in African mythology and folklore. We'll use Jung's four main archetypes to organize our talk. And the four main archetypes, we've mentioned them before: the anima and animus, the persona, the self, and the shadow. We'll also talk about the character archetypes that have emerged from further application of Jung's work. And we'll define these archetypes and other related concepts as we go along. We will also look at criticisms of and elaborations of Jung's framework to better understand the mechanisms of these patterns and images and how they are being better understood with recent understanding of the human psychology and what technology is revealing to us. And each month we'll have an archetype as a theme, an archetype or two as a theme. We'll read and discuss a selection of stories of myths, folklores, and legends whose characters or whose events embody or encode aspects of the archetype or archetypes in question. So for the rest of the month of February and in March, we'll focus on the archetype of the ruler. So here we'll look at stories of chiefs and kings and queens and princes and princesses and what they reveal about authority and its expression and articulation in the African context. In April, we'll focus on the archetype of the magician. And here we'll look at stories of sorcerers and sorceresses, as well as the much debated topic of witchcraft. In May, we'll focus on the archetype of the sage, the one who dispenses wisdom. And with all the proverbs we have on the African continent, that should be a good one. In June, we'll focus on the caregiver. And here we will examine stories of mothers and fathers and step parents. And then in July and August, we'll look at the orphan and the innocent archetype to complement the just ending conversation about caregivers. And this is because children are usually the focus of the orphan and the innocent archetype. So it makes sense to talk about caregivers, mothers, fathers, step parents, and then segue into talking about children. In September, we'll move on to the archetype of the fool. And with this, we'll roll in aspects of the trickster and the messenger who are so common in African folklore. In October and November, we'll examine heroes and heroines, and this will bring in aspects of the rebel, the explorer, the lover, and the warrior archetype. We'll leave December open so we can tie up loose ends and cover anything we missed during the year. So this is the general plan, but it's not set in stone. If anything comes up, if some tangent arises that we want to go explore or some rabbit hole, then we can do that as well. The other thing this year is that I'm going to experiment with different formats. So I've had requests for MA to be on YouTube before, but I've still not successfully connected my Substack to YouTube for some reason. But hopefully I'll sort that out this year. I think it's a technical glitch where, things are not connecting the way they should. But hopefully we'll have the MA podcast on YouTube. I might try to do some videos where I will be on screen, especially when I have a guest speaker, which I'm hoping to do more of that this year. So I hope you stick around for it all. It's going to be a good time. I think it's a good conversation to be having at this point in time. And I hope to see you next week for our first episode on the archetype of the ruler. Thank you as always for listening.